Hi everyone, welcome to Dev 101 with Ali. He's going to be your instructor for tonight. Also, stay tuned for our other workshops that are coming. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you don't have a team for Storm Hacks so far, you can join us on our pre-launch party where we'll introduce you to other members and you can make your teams. Keep posting questions throughout. Ali will answer them as he has points where he'll stop in the middle just to answer questions. So he'll answer them then. And Ali, yeah, you can take it away from here.
Okay, sweet. Hi everybody. My name is Ali. I'm a fourth year comp sci student, and I've done a lot of web development. I helped create the STORMHACKS.com website, so we have some experience. Um, so before I start, I kind of want to just kind of gauge the audience. So go ahead and put in chat, like how much do you guys know about these three languages, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, web development, right? So like 1 is like you're completely new to this stuff. 10 is like, oh, you're an expert. Maybe you've done an internship before. Yeah, so this is gonna help me gauge like which areas I should speed up on, which areas I should slow down on. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's cool. Also, if you guys want to follow along, we're gonna do a lot of, live coding in VS Code. I have this HTML template you can copy paste into VS Code and kind of quickly, just for anyone who's super new to this stuff, you can, in VS Code, if you're using VS Code, you can like copy paste that template I just sent, the GitHub link, and then okay, sorry. And then you can load this up onto a browser and see your work. So you can just grab this window and put it here and it'll open up the document. Obviously it's empty right now because it's just a template, but that's something we can do. And then every time you save this file, you can just refresh this document here. So yeah, let's kind of get started. This is what I hope we can finish building by the end of this. It's going to be this kind of list. But yeah, we'll see how far we can get. I think we'll be able to get through all of this. So what makes the web is these three things: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They each have their own task or job to do. So HTML is the structure of the content. The CSS is what the content looks like, and JavaScript is how it behaves, how you can interact with it, and how we can dynamically change things on the fly. So the first two are just static, and then JavaScript really makes things interactive. So HTML is a markup language, which means that it's just used to display content. So we have these tags, which are surrounded in angle brackets, and there's hundreds of these things. You don't have to memorize them. This is a P tag. P stands for paragraph, and it's kind of one of the fundamental building blocks of HTML. There's also, like, here's an example of a bold tag, a B, and then these tags can have attributes, right? So this is a refresher for some of you, but it may be new to some of you. So these attributes are metadata, which you don't see on the screen when you visit the website, but play into the website. So this is a link to an image of a cat. So that's the image down here. I'm sure we can get the slides available. I might upload them to the GitHub. So, and then here's another one, an href. So this href here, an a tag is a link, and href is where it's pointing to, and then we write the link name here. So here we see the link name, but if we were to click on this, it would go to the SFU Search GitHub, or sorry, Facebook group. So yeah, those are some of the basic tags. There are more. So some common ones, especially during a hackathon, you'll use inputs to get input from a user. Divs have absolutely nothing on their own. They are purely invisible, but they are used to group pieces of data together, and then you can style those groups. Buttons are things you can click on. Links are how you load CSS files. scripts are how you load JavaScript files. So HTML is kind of the center of it all, and then you load in these assets, these CSS and JavaScript files into your HTML. So two very important properties or attributes, class and ID. This is how you can, in JavaScript and CSS, specify a specific node or element. So here we have this ID of my paragraph. Later on, we'll be able to select that, and we'll see an example. So let's do some examples right now. Yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think some of us have experience with this. If I'm going too fast, please tell me in chat and I will slow down. So this is kind of what HTML looks like. A lot of this is boilerplate, which is why I just gave it to you guys. It's kind of the template for HTML. So the one thing here is this document, and this will be the name in the Chrome tab right here. So this word right here came from us. So we can change this to HTML or whatever we want, and then when we refresh this, it'll update. So we can kind of get some ideas of some of the tags that you might use. H stands for header, and then you follow it up with a number between 1 and 6. So like H1 is a big header, and then we can have H2, which is like a smaller header, and then we have all the way up to H6, which is your smallest header. And then of course, we have the paragraph tag. So I'll just show that just so we have that. What else? So here we can see, we can create a div and put some items inside of the div, and these won't really do anything. So we can, I'm gonna copy paste this. So this is an image here. So here we have a source. And so in the slides, we saw a source coming from the internet, but source can also come from your local directory. So this is saying, so we're in here, we're in demo. So it's saying go back one, then go into this assets folder, and then load up this SVG file as an image. And then we have this other paragraph here. And this will show that the div has no impact. Another one, important one, input, and we'll see what that looks like. And then the one cool thing about input is placeholder, which is kind of like something you'll see before you type anything. So let's load up all of this now. All right, so let's go through this. So we have the big header here, which is the biggest text. Smaller header, this was H2, right? And then we can see smallest header is actually smaller than a paragraph. But notice how it's bolded. So all headers are bolded. So here we have the image and the paragraph below it. And so this paragraph and this paragraph really have nothing different from each other, even though this one wasn't a div. So that div really didn't do much. And here we can see that input. So it's this like little text box that you can click into and type stuff. And there's the placeholder right there. So yeah, that's pretty much HTML in a nutshell. There are more of these kind of elements, but most of the time, especially in a hackathon where you're trying to do things quickly, you can stick with pretty much what you see on the screen. H1 tags for your headers, paragraph for just text, divs to divide up different regions, images, more paragraphs, and inputs. Oh, and one more, buttons, something to click on. So here we can see that button, and right now it doesn't do anything, but that's where JavaScript comes in. Later on, we'll see that. Yeah, so any questions so far? HTML, hopefully it's kind of a refresher. All right, cool. Yeah, you can type questions in chat anytime you have any, and I'll get to them when we take our next coding example. So a note on modern HTML. So this is kind of the newest versions. It's semantic. So instead of using divs, which is what I just told you guys to do in a hackathon, there's all these different things that are pretty much like divs. They just look different in your code. And so you have article, section, label, header, main, aside nav. So this is how do you break up your content in a meaningful way. Why don't we use them in a hackathon? Because you have to remember them, and also each one is styled slightly differently, which kind of screws with you when you're doing CSS. You have to reset styles, and it's kind of a mess to work with. Yeah, so you just save some time in a hackathon. But why do we use them in the real world? If you're curious, there's two reasons. One is that they are much easier to like maintain for developers. If you know, instead of looking for a div, you can look for nav, and that's where your nav work is. And also screen readers have a really easy time going through websites that have this functionality, that have these semantic tags. They can look around and skip around very quickly for visually impaired users. So let's go into CSS syntax. So CSS is how you style code, remember? Or you style your website. So we have this syntax here, which is your selector. This is something that you will type in, and then a curly brace, and then you have a list of properties in between these curly braces. And so they come in a key value kind of pair here, and they end with a semicolon, and you start another property, and you can keep going down the list as many as you need. So properties are like things like you can change the color, the font size, what font it is, stuff like that. So here's an example right here. So this is following that same syntax. So your selector right here. So this hashtag at the beginning is saying look for an ID. So hash is an ID. You can also put a period here, and that's saying look for a class. And if you put nothing here, it means look for an element of this type. So obviously a my paragraph element does not exist, but you can do a p, just a p here, and that would grab all paragraphs in your document, which is why sometimes you would use IDs, because you only want to change a specific element. And we'll see examples of this too. So here we're setting the color. This is the text color to hash FF0000, and this is RGB syntax. So the first two are full brightness on red. The second two are no brightness on green, no brightness on blue. So this is a red color. Yeah. And so there's a lot of CSS properties. Don't memorize these either. Google is your best friend. You can always just Google CSS how to do X, and the first link will be a Stack Overflow, which the first answer will answer your question. So a couple important ones in here, like just so maybe you'll recognize a few. You have like grid, flexbox, color, border, stuff like that. So you can like resize stuff. You can move them around. Overflow, which is like scrolling behavior. Yeah, there's a lot of these. You can do a lot with CSS. So, so a couple examples of how powerful CSS is. It's pretty much everything to do with style. So this is Facebook. I'm scrolling through Facebook here when I deleted the CSS files that Facebook requires. So you can see there's just plain paragraphs, A tags, which are those hyperlinks, and images. There's nothing fancy going on here. Then this is what your HTML would look like. So we can have a live example of this. And so if we go to StormHacks, the website, our website, so here's StormHacks in case you haven't seen it. So we have, all these different tabs and, all this fancy functionality. But at the end of the day, that's all through CSS, and we can delete that CSS file. So if we find the CSS file in the head, it's right here. Remember, a link loads a CSS file. So this is our CSS file, and if we delete that, well, this is what StormHacks looks like without CSS. It's kind of just all over the place, randomly placed images and text and images, and that's pretty much it. This is what you're looking at. Now note that even though we deleted the CSS file, HTML still works. It's kind of in the right order, and also JavaScript still works. So this X still works. It'll still close and open the thing. It's just not styled, right? So that's the only difference. All your JavaScript still works because I didn't delete the JavaScript links, which are right here. But yeah, so that's kind of what CSS is. And so we can look at a few examples of CSS. I'm gonna close all of these and we can open up. So here we have some HTML code, and so kind of how we would grab different elements. So we can do, right, so most of these are IDs, and maybe I'll make this a class for better examples. So here we can do hashtag, and then you just do the, whatever this is. So hash red, and then we can do color. So you can do colors how I did before, like that. You can also type in a color name, and there's a lot that are predefined. So here my autofiller gives me a whole list. So all these are valid colors. You can type in the word and your browser will just automatically know what that is. So we can type in red here and that'll work. And then so class, you start with a period, as I said. So period big, we'll grab this second paragraph and we'll change its font size and we'll set it to like 45 point font. So you can kind of, modify your elements as you need. And then, so now we want to underline all 3 paragraphs. So in that case, we would just use the P selector with nothing else. So we're just saying find all paragraphs in our body and style them. So here we can do text declaration. So that's another property, and underlined is the value that would underline it. So now we can save this and load it up. And we can see, ta-da, all 3 are underlined. This guy is really big. This guy is red. This guy is just underlined. There's nothing special about that. So if we kind of, show the before code by commenting it out, we can see this is what it used to look like, just like 3 paragraphs standard. So now I think we can do a little bit more fancy features of CSS because there's some more things we can do with CSS. So let's bring back that example from before with the div does not do anything. So let's reload this. So you can see this paragraph and this paragraph are identical here. So the div isn't actually doing anything right now. And we have the image here again. But we can make the div do something. So if we select it, hashtag flex, which is the ID of the div, we can give it this display flex. And what display flex does is it changes how the items are ordered. So right now they're ordered top to down, right? So the image comes first, then the paragraph. If we put another paragraph, it'll come below that. By default, if you do display flex, they come from left to right. So if we refresh this page now, we can see that this paragraph appears to the right of the image and not under it. So this is, so like if you had a vertical list and you wanted to nest that in a horizontal list, you can use divs with display flex to change their direction. And so let's make the div do even more. There's an align items property, and we can just put them to center. And so you might be able to predict this div is going to move down here to be centered with the image, just like that. So again, there's a whole lot of these properties and a whole lot of ways to do CSS. Some practice might be nice, just try and like style something or build a small little just plain text website, and just so you can get kind of the feel for it. So period and hashtag. So the period is used to select classes. So when you do period big, you're saying find an element, any element, it can be an image, a div, it doesn't care. Any element that has a class of big. So right here, this has a class of big, and that's what you're selecting here. So the period specifies a class. And similarly, a hash represents an ID. So you're saying find any element that has a hash of, or has an ID of flex in this case, or an ID of red in this case. And so if we give this class to multiple things, right? So let's give this class to both of these paragraphs. They will both get the styles from dot big. So there we go, now they're both big. So classes are not unique. they can be applied to multiple things. So what's the difference between a class and an ID? A class can be applied to multiple items in your HTML page. An ID should be unique. So when you're saying this paragraph has an ID of red, it should be the only paragraph, it should be the only element in your entire document that has this ID. Yeah. So yeah, so now we have this kind of, and then one last thing, this is getting a little bit more advanced. How would you add spacing between the sentence and the picture? So right here, that's actually a good question. So let's see. So you can do this with either padding or margin, and it's confusing that there's two. But so first things first, we should be able to grab this paragraph right here. So because this paragraph isn't the only paragraph, we need to give it an ID or something. So let's give it an ID of space. And so then we can use that to grab this paragraph. So now any styling we write will be applied to this paragraph. And then here we can say margin left and then give it something, some value, like let's say 40 pixels. And so what that should do, there we go. Now we have this gap here that's 40 pixels wide between the image and this, the start of this. We can also do padding left 40 pixels, and that would achieve the same thing. And so you might be asking, what's the difference between margin and padding? You will notice the difference if we give this a border, which I don't remember how to do off the top of my head. So how about instead of a border, we give it a background color of light gray. So you can see here, this background color is, well, background color will work. So we can see this area, this spacing is now colored, and that may or may not be what you want. So if it is, then you use padding. If it's not, you use margin. So margin excludes, so margin kind of pushes the element, padding extends the element. So now you're saying this paragraph includes this space or does not include. So margin says does not include this space. Padding says does include this space. So if we switch back to padding, so we can see it here, padding takes up that space. So yeah, that's kind of, so if you see this and it's kind of weird, then you might notice, or you might know how to fix that. So it margin and padding right there. So yeah, we can leave this, and let's create a div down here. And this is, and we're going to give it a class, or sorry, an ID of query. And so let's grab it. So first things first, we want to give it a width. So let's give it a width of 100 pixels. We also want to give it a height. So divs by default, remember, they have nothing about them. They're completely nothing. So an empty div doesn't actually render on the page. It's a 0 pixel by 0 pixel item. So we need to specify its width and height if we want it to show up on the page. Obviously, if there's stuff inside the div, then the div will show up taking up the space of the stuff inside of it. So yeah, but this div is empty, so there's nothing inside of it. So we need to specify a height and a width. And obviously we won't be able to see it on a white page unless we give it a color. So let's give it a background color of light gray again. And we should be able to see this box right here, this light gray box in this bottom corner. So a thing about responsive CSS is instead of giving these a property of 100 pixels, there's a lot of units you can use. So, and we can see my autofiller has so many units. The important one here is percent. So percent is saying, give me blank percentage of my parent. Now this div is a parent of the body, so that would be a percentage of the entire Chrome window. So let's say we give this 50. Let's give it just to kind of make you believe me, right? If I rescale this window, that box is not changing, right? We can see the text shrinks and stuff like that, but the box doesn't change size. But now if we give it percent and we can bring this down to like 70, we can see, well, this is a certain amount of width, right? But as we change the window size, it changes with that. So it always stays at exactly 70% of however wide your screen is. And remember, this is relative to parent, but in most cases, that will be relative to the entire view window. So that's a note on percentage values. So that's how you can make things responsive. And then also to go even a level up. So it's like, what if I want to apply a set of styles only if the screen is, 300 pixels, only if it's a phone, right? So we can do that with app media. So this app media, let's ignore that. So this app media here is a special selector. So we had dots, we had hashtags, but these were selecting elements. App media, this is called a directive. It's actually kind of like calling a function with the name app media. There's nothing else to write. It's just writing app media. And inside of the function, or inside of these brackets, you can provide it certain certain conditions. So here we're going to write max width and then 400, or we'll make it a little bit bigger. Let's go with 800 pixels. So we're saying, and then in here, inside of these curly braces, which surround this media query, we call these media queries, these app media, we call them media queries. Inside of here, we can write CSS styles, just like we did before. And these styles will only get added to the elements if the condition is true. So if you can read this condition, max width 800. So if the screen has a maximum width of 800, so if it's any width less than 800, then apply these conditions. So in here, we can write we can grab the same element at query and change its background color. So let's say if it's on a small screen, this should be black. The background color should be black. If it's a big screen, it should be light gray. So now if we refresh the page, nothing happened, right? It's still light gray, but that's because this screen right here is 1285 pixels wide. So if we shrink this down and we pass 800, look for it, it's gonna happen. Boom, we just passed 800 pixels and it's now black. And then if we go larger than 800, it becomes light gray again. So this style, this right here, is only being applied if the screen is less than 800 pixels. So that's called a media query, and it's how you can style things. So how does the same website you go to work on your phone and on your desktop and not look like trash on your phone without media queries? We just change what the website looks like. We almost write twice as much CSS. We write one CSS for the desktop and then another whole set of CSS for the mobile display. Now, I'm going to keep adding these caveats about hackathons because we don't want to waste time during a hackathon. So when you're designing for your hackathon, really think, is this going to be used on mobile, desktop, or both? If it's only going to be used on mobile, then what I recommend you do is you go into Chrome, you hit F12 to bring up this side menu, and you just shrink it down to like somewhere around 350 to 400 pixels, because this is what a mobile screen will look like. So if you and then don't design for desktop. And then same thing in reverse. If you're going to be using desktop, keep this pretty small. Give yourself like at least 1200 pixels of screen realistic, and only design for desktop. But if your app is being used in both, well, now you know how to create CSS for both with these app media queries. So that's a little bit about CSS. Yeah, if there's any questions, you can ask now, or else we can move on. All right, cool. So JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language, a full-fledged programming language, one of the most popular in the world. I think it's actually the most popular right now. But yeah, well, let's just go over some really quick syntax about JavaScript before we get into why it's so unique. This is how you declare variables. JavaScript is weakly typed, which means that you don't say this variable is an integer, this variable is a string. You don't say that. You just declare a variable, and JavaScript will deduce its type for you. So here we're declaring a const and then a variable name, and here we're declaring let and then the variable name. So the distinction between const and let is that const variables cannot be overwritten. This will actually throw an error in the console. You can't change what a const variable is, but you can change what a let variable is. So if you're kind of creating variables that you don't want to touch again, then use const. Otherwise, use let. And so here is an example. We can change this variable, which was originally an integer, to a string. JavaScript does not care. You can change things on the fly. It's very dynamic like that. So what's the difference between var and let? You guys might see a lot of var. Don't use var. So pretty much var was the original way to write JavaScript code. And then in 2015, they released a new version of JavaScript, which does not include var, or it does include var, but they introduced const and let. So var are technically full global variables that are accessible from any part of your code. Now they're not it's not obviously accessible. It's just it's there. It's like kind of ghostly in the background there. So use let if there is no difference between let and var. Just use let. And I'm 99% sure there is technically a difference between var and let. So in a very edge case scenario, you will see it, but 99%, like during a hackathon, you won't. Yeah, so let is kind of scoped. So like if you write a let within a function, you cannot access that variable outside the function. Kind of like every other variable in C or Python or C++, Java, whatever. Variables aren't global. And we can do an example of that when we do some JS in a few minutes. So functions can be written just like, so there's this 2015 shift, and so a lot of things are duplicated. So functions are another one of that. So there's two ways to write a function. There are arrow functions, which are written like this. So we store them in a variable. So we're saying const add, and this is the function name, equals, and then we write brackets with a list of parameters inside and this arrow here that you might have seen, especially if you've done C# before, you'll see this arrow. And then curly braces, and then we write JavaScript code inside of it. The other way is to declare function add, and then the list of parameters. So this is the name of the function, parameters, curly braces, and then your code. This is the newer way, and for 99% of the time, this is the right way to do it. There's nothing wrong with this. Unlike var, which has a side effect, there's absolutely no side effect with using these functions. But just like it just happens that a lot of JavaScript developers have moved to using arrow functions wherever possible. But yeah, so yeah, these are more often used. So this is how we write functions. So now we get into some weird, so JavaScript syntax is very much like C or C++ minus the typing. But we get into some uniqueness about JavaScript and its dynamic environment. Truthy is a JavaScript term. You may or may not have heard of it. Truthy is something that is true or evaluates to true or exists, kind of existence is true. So let's go through some examples. This is gonna be a little bit mind bending, so let's take it slow. So I wrote this function here, right? So remember, this is a function. It has one parameter, which is our value, and an arrow, and then we'll print something. So console log is JavaScript print. So if the value is truthy, so if an if statement thinks that it's true, we'll print it's true. If else, if the if statement thinks it's false, we'll print it's false. And we're going to establish a baseline here. So we're going to pass in the literal words true and false and see what it thinks about those. And then we'll do some more complicated examples after that. So let's bring up the browser again and load it up. And so obviously we don't see anything. This is in the console, so that's in that F12 menu. Another way to open it is to right click on the page and click inspect. This will open this side menu. And then there's this console right here. So if you click on it, we can see some text. So should be true, that was true. Should be false, that was false. So if we look at our code, right? So we said this should be true and we passed in true. Should be false, we passed in false. Right, so now let's write some more. So is truthy, right? So this is the function we wrote. Let's pass some stuff in. So does a string evaluate to true or false? What do you guys think? So if we follow that loose rule of true or existence, this should evaluate to true. And it does, okay. Is truthy, let's try an empty string. Now technically that exists, but does it really? No, it doesn't. An empty string evaluates to false. So this is where we get to some interesting scenarios. So an empty string evaluates to false. Is truthy? Okay, let's keep going. An array of items, will that evaluate to true? Yes. What about an empty array? And this is where you start to lose your mind. It's also true. It's not an empty string. Don't ask me why. This is how JavaScript was written. An empty array is true. And what about objects? An empty object, just like a full object, is also true. And so you might be asking, what the heck is false? Only the literal false in this. There are two other things that evaluate to false. Undefined. Oh, that's not undefined. Okay, there we go. Undefined evaluates to false, and null evaluates to false. So an empty string, undefined, null, and the word false all evaluate to false. So yeah, that's truthy for you. So if you ever hear truthy, that's what they're talking about. So things could evaluate to true. And so like we get some weird shenanigans here where it's like, all right, the number 100 is a number, it exists, it's true, but the number 0 evaluates to false because the number 0 is often a Boolean for false, right? So yeah, the things kind of get weird. Now, I'm actually not sure about this one, so we're gonna learn on the spot. Okay, the string 0 evaluates to true. Okay, good. So yeah, this is what, if you ever hear truthy, this is what that is. The JavaScript is kind of weird with that. Yeah, so you might see this in the future, and this is kind of like, you'll see like this if and a value, and it's like, well, it's dynamically typed, so this isn't a Boolean. It could be, a string, a number, an array, an object, something like that. What is the practical use of truthy? If you ask a user for an input or something, you can kind of do an if statement, and if they passed in an empty string, then it would evaluate to false. Otherwise, no matter what the string is, it would evaluate to true. And also, if they didn't provide you with a string, so if they gave you an empty string, it would be false. If they didn't provide you with a string, then it would be undefined, and that would also be false. So it's things like that. So yeah, that's JavaScript truthy. Now let's talk about objects. Objects get a bit complicated as well. This is like the meat and bread of JavaScript is objects. So an object is an untyped struct from C, if you guys have done C before. So here we have an object, and we have a key value pair, and there's a bunch of them. And there's 3 ways to declare an empty space will evaluate true. We can we can do that. Yeah, an empty space evaluates to true, or a string with a space in it evaluates to true. It's only an empty string that will evaluate to false. So yeah. So objects, there's three ways to declare the right-hand side or the left-hand side, and the right-hand side can be anything you want: an array, another object, a string, a number, whatever. On the left-hand side, however, there's three ways. So there's numbers, there's literals, and there's strings. So this is called a literal because it's not a string, it's just kind of like a variable that you just declared, but it's not a variable on its own. It's part of this object. So here we can do object dot name. It's kind of like a method or a property from a class, right? Dot name, and this will print literal, which is the value of that key. So you can also access objects like arrays, and this acts and is implemented like a hash table. So if you do object square 2, it will hash find this value number right here. So yeah, it's in key value pairs. And then you can also do that on strings. So there we have a string, and it will print string. So yeah, on the left-hand side, strings, literals, or numbers. On the right-hand side, anything, including other objects, which means you can nest objects. If we look at this little code down here, so we have this object with curly braces, and inside of it we have another object with curly braces, and then inside of that nested object we finally have our key value pairs. And so if you kind of think about what I said here, this number thing, right? So like this looks like an array, right? Object number. Yeah, JavaScript arrays are objects with keys starting from 0 and counting up. That is how an array is defined an object. So if you actually create an array in JavaScript, this is, const my array is an array, and you do type of, yeah, it's kind of an object. So yeah, let's do some JavaScript examples with that being said. And we're gonna touch this timer here. So that's gonna be the first example we'll do. We're gonna make this timer work. So let's load this into the browser, and it's not gonna do anything because we haven't written the JavaScript, but we can see the number 0 here. And maybe I'll zoom in so it's bigger. But yeah, this is not changing. There's no JavaScript. Also a side note, your JavaScript code can go inside of a script tag. So in here I can write const x equals 10, right? So I can write JavaScript code, right? This is not HTML, but it's inside of an HTML script tag. Or here you can link a JavaScript file, and it'll load that file for you. So there's two ways to write that. For simplicity, we're just gonna write it here inside of this script tag. So the first thing we wanna do is kind of access this thing. And so this is where we get to connecting things together. How do we access a timer? Well, we can do, there's this global object that's available to us. So is there a difference between writing in the body and the head? There is a difference, and no, but where you write it in the head or where you write it in the body. So if you write in the head, that's fine. And in fact, that's where you usually write your script tags. If you write in the body, where you put it does matter, and I'll explain why it matters in just 1 second. So let's talk about how we can grab an HTML element from JavaScript. So there's this global object that's available to us that we can use. So let's store it. We're going to store it in a variable, and we'll call it timer equals, and the global object is called document. So this is a keyword, And this document has a crap load of properties that we can access and that do different things with HTML. The one we care about right now is get element by ID. So this is very much a CSS hashtag, pretty much. You're saying, I want some element in the HTML that has this ID that I'm going to pass to you as a string. So in here we write timer. And so this doesn't have to be timer. It can be any name you want it to be. So this is the important part. So you're saying this is the ID I'm looking for, and we can see that this is right here. So back to the question, doesn't matter where you load your script tags. If I load this script tag above the timer, this will fail because this timer does not exist yet. It has not been loaded yet. So if you're doing a script tag in the body, you want to do it at the very bottom. Yeah, and script written later can also overwrite scripts written earlier. That is true. Yes, the order of, that's only if you have conflicting names and stuff like that. So yeah, so now we have this timer in JavaScript, but like, what do we do with it? Well, let's try and change its value. So a timer, so the thing returned to us by this getElementById function is itself another object. And that object has a lot of properties. Let's print them with console.dir. And this will print us a bunch, this will pretty much print the object for us. So if we kind of load this again, wow, look at all those properties it has that we can access. So yeah, that's a lot of properties. You almost never want to go through this list. You just kind of Google it. You're like, what this is, I have a HTML DOM node and I want to do this with it. And you kind of that, I already know because I've done it a lot of times, but we can do, one property it has is inner text. And so this inner text is this right here. Whatever is inside of it, we can overwrite that. So we can, and with an equals. So this inner text is the property that contains the text. So here we can write number 1. And if we reload this page, we can see the number 1 here, even though it should be whatever this is. And it's like, okay, well, great. Ali, you still haven't made a timer. So let's talk about another global thing you have access to, set interval. So this is a function. This is a looping sleep function. So it takes in 2 parameters, a function and a timer. So we'll set it to 100 milliseconds. So this is time in milliseconds. And we can create our function here. And so every 100 milliseconds, it will call foo. And so inside of foo, we can pass in, we can pass in a new number. And so let's create that number. I'll name it I, and we'll start at 0. And then every time we'll update it, and then we'll increment I as well. So this is like I++. You could always do I equals I+1 if you want to be super explicit, but either way, we're incrementing I and we're writing it in. So hopefully now we'll see this. Yeah, it's increasing by 1 every 100 milliseconds. So that's 10 times per second. So if you kind of think about this is the second right here, the 7, 8, 9, and it's going up. It's just writing whatever I is into it. And so you might be thinking, well, can we stop it? Of course we can. We need some more code. So we need a button that we can click. You know, this is, things are finally coming together. Stop timer. So now we have this time button here, but it doesn't do anything yet. So buttons have this property, and it's a very, very important property called onClick. And this onClick will take a string that evaluates to a JavaScript function it can call. So we'll call the function stop timer, and we'll call that function, and then we can write the function down here. Const stop timer equals, it's a function. It takes in no parameters. And then in here, we need to be able to clear this interval. So set interval actually returns something to you. It returns a number to you. So this is kind of like if you've ever worked with files, this is a kind of like a file descriptor. So we can do const my interval equals set interval. So we didn't change the call to set interval, but now we're taking in that number. And so just like set interval is provided to you, there's also clear interval, which is used to stop intervals. So in here we can call, so this function gets called from this button, and what it does is it calls clear interval on my interval. And so this is a good practice to get into. Some of you might have noticed I am deliberately choosing where I use const and let, depending on if I plan to ever change that value. So I am planning to change that. This function I'm not planning to change. The timer I'm not planning to change. I plan to change its properties. That's allowed, but I do not plan to change its root element itself. I'm not planning to change it. And so here, my interval, this number, I will never touch that. I am just storing that for future use. So if I wrote this as a let, I might accidentally override it later on, and then we can't call clear interval on it. So let's try that again. Timer's going, and we stopped it by calling clear interval. So that's clear interval stops an interval from continuing. So just one last note, just like set interval, there's also set timeout, which is a sleep function. So it's saying sleep for 100 milliseconds, then call this, but only once. So set interval says do it every 100 milliseconds. Set timeout says do it once, and then you're done. And then in that case, you don't need to worry about this. You can still stop it. So like, let's say this was on a 300, 30-second thing, right? So if this was on a 30-second thing, you can still call clear interval before it happens. And so like you might actually use this, right? It's like a common use case of this is like, okay, if I lose internet connection, let's retry every 300 milliseconds. But at some point, or let's time out for 30 seconds and then try again. But if you reconnect to the internet in between that time, you might want to stop this try again call because that might cause some recursion you don't want, something like that. So yeah, that's timeout. I think that's it for right now. So yeah, let's review what we just covered. We just covered a lot. So there's this global document object, and it has a lot of properties like get element by ID, query selector. So query selector, unlike get element by ID, is a little bit slower, but Hackathon don't care about optimization. You can copy paste straight up a CSS selector. So if we go back to this example, instead of doing get element by ID, we could do query selector. And then in here, we would do hash timer. So we have to provide that hash because we're now no longer saying this is an ID. I know it's an ID. It can be an ID. It could be an element. We can grab a p tag. It could be a class name, right? It can be anything we want as long as it's a valid CSS selector. So that's another way to do it. And similarly, to get to query selector, there's query selector all, which will give you so like, let's say you select a class and there's 10 elements of that class. Query selector will give you the first one. Query selector all will give you all of them in an array of items. And then this final one here, which we'll see, is create element. So this is how you can actually create new elements and push them into the browser, into the HTML file. So yeah, now you'll hear this word around a lot, DOM. So this stands for Document Object Model, and that's exactly what we just went over. So a document, that's your HTML page, that's your document, I call that the document, and it's represented as a JavaScript object. So we have those properties we can access with just periods, right? Timer.innerText, right? So this timer is a DOM node, a document object model node. It's an object that represents this p tag in JavaScript. So that's kind of how they link together. So we often call that a node. So if you hear me say the node, you've probably heard me missay node in case you didn't know what that was. I was talking about this timer. These things can be represented. So yeah, aside from this inner text, there's, remember, a lot of properties. Another one of note is style. So we can do dot style, and then after the period, you can specify any CSS style using camel case, or yeah, camel case instead of hyphens. So if you remember, font size from here, or was font dash size. In JavaScript, it would be font capital S size. So it's a little bit of conversion. Now, if you're curious, this is because this came after, like, JavaScript came after CSS and HTML, so this is kind of an afterthought. But yeah, so, and then here you can, set it to 25 pixels or points or whatever. And that would work identically to setting it in CSS. It's just a way to do it through JavaScript. So for example, you can create an input and then be like, hey, how big do you want this text to be? And then read that input in JavaScript and then change the size. Kind of, get an idea from that. Yeah. So we kind of just did this. I'm going to take a second. Yeah, I'm just going to take a second here. And if there's any questions on DOM and stuff like that. All right, cool. Yeah, so let's talk about some of the APIs. So these globally defined things to you are called APIs. So there's the document API, there's the set timeout and the set interval API. There's the fetch API. So this is something you might use a lot. I use this a lot personally. So you're saying request this endpoint. So this could be an image. It could be an entire HTML page. It could be some JSON object that you want to, like, some data from a backend server or something. And then you're saying this dot then, so JavaScript won't wait around for this. It'll keep running other code. So that's not, it doesn't look janky. So the reason you'll see a lot of this dot then in JavaScript, and that's because it never wants to wait for databases. It never wants to wait for network. And that's because it should be rendering at 60 FPS to make things silky smooth. So it often has this kind of bypass. You can kind of think about these as creating background threads to do the work for you. So it'll access this resource and then it'll call your function with the data that it gets back. And another one that's really cool, local storage. If you guys don't know, browsers are really powerful nowadays. They can store a lot of information that you can store, or that you can store on normal apps. Like they can store things permanently using local storage. They can store things for a while the tab is open using session storage. So that's just like local storage. They can access your location using GPS data. They can do a lot of stuff. They can access on your phone. This is where we get into PWA. Progressive web apps, they can store on your mobile device. They can get your Bluetooth. They can get your NFC chip, which is like how you read cards and stuff like that. But yeah, browsers are powerful now. The reason I say think dark mode is like you can store whether or not the user prefers dark mode in local storage. And then later on, when your website opens, you can kind of remember that. And fun fact, that's exactly how we do StormHacks. So if I, refresh and bring back our CSS file, so you can see my website automatically goes to dark mode. It doesn't go to the light mode version every single time. And in the debugging tools, we can see I store this key value pair theme dark. So I actually store this in local storage. And so it's stored anytime you access this website, https stormhacks.com, it will remember that I want dark mode. And so every time my app opens up, the first thing it does when this app renders is it looks at my local storage and it says, does that key exist? If it does, what's its value? And so if the key doesn't exist, it'll default to light mode. But if the key does exist, it'll read its value. So if the value is light mode, it'll default to light mode. If its value is dark, it'll default to dark mode, or it'll load up dark mode. So that's how it works throughout like different refreshes. Yeah, so this is stored locally. It's not calling a database or something to store your IP address or something. It's like, oh, this IP address prefers dark mode or something. So yeah, we talked about how we can handle button clicks. So you call a JavaScript function, and so they take in this event as a parameter. They can, and so I kind of want to show that off because taking in an event is kind of important. So an event in JavaScript is a parameter passed into every function that gets called by a user triggered event. So this is your on clicks. There are more things like if we have an input, we can have a on change, we can have a on press, on key press, you know, so these are all events, right? They are something that happens because of a user. So in this stop interval, we can take this event and let's just console log the event and see what we get from that. So, whoops. Yeah, okay. So let's refresh this and let's click it and we can see, whoa, this is what the event is, and it's an object. It has a bunch of properties. So we can see kind of like, this is where our mouse was when we clicked it. This is the time that we clicked the button. We can see what the type of the event was. It was a click event. And there's one important one. This target right here is the item you clicked on. So this is a button. And this would be equivalent to, so if we did event.target, this event.target is the equivalent of doing a document query selector and grabbing this button. So those are identical. So it's like, yeah, it's a different way of getting it. Yeah, I think we don't have time to get into the really cool app that puts all this together. And that's just because, not because it's complicated, but because it's a lot of code. Simple apps like that, despite looking simple, do take quite a bit of code. So we can use my cheat sheet here, which is a pre-filled version because I planned ahead of time. So we can see all the CSS that was involved in kind of getting that website, that example we saw. So let's load it up here. Index.html. So here, this is the list, the shopping list. You can add items, and then you can click on items to delete them. And I'll just show off the how this works. I'll show off how this works in the code. And then also you can click this button in this corner here, and it'll delete the list. And also, just like how we did dark theme for the StormHacks website, we store this information across renders in your in local storage. So yeah, let's kind of look at some of the. So most of this you'll have seen, and I'll go over some of it that you haven't seen. Some newer kind of things. So here, this is a form element. A form element is a very important element if you want to fill out a form when you click enter. So like you guys saw there that when I was adding an element, I'm not clicking on this add button. I'm just pressing enter on my keyboard, and it does that. So the way that works is that if you're on an input and it's surrounded by a form and you click enter, it will fill that. It will call the on submit of the form. And this on submit is a handle submit JavaScript function. And we can see this JavaScript if we put it here. So let's kind of close off all of the functionality so we don't really spook anyone. So here we go. So this handle submit does some stuff here, right? So this is the function that gets called by this form being submitted. So the form can get submitted in two ways, right? One is we click enter on any input element. That will call a submit form. And then if you click on a button that has this specific property right here, type equals submit, it will also submit the form. So this is a cool way to seamlessly be able to get user data without having them to manually move their mouse on a thing and click on it. So yeah, and we can see I turned off autocomplete, so it doesn't, bring up those autocomplete things. If I, turn it back on and we refresh the page, when we click on it, it'll try and autocomplete for us. So there's these properties. And before I filled this, I actually had no idea how to do that. I Googled it. I Googled HTML input disable autocomplete. And the first solution had this line of code. I copy pasted it and it worked. So Google is your best friend, truly, learning how to do everything. There's just so much to know in web development that you'll never know it all. So don't be afraid to Google things. And don't be afraid to admit that you don't know things. I just admitted that I don't know everything. So anyway, this event has another very important function, prevent default. HTML has a lot of annoying default actions, which are things that an event will do that you don't want them to do. So for example, a form submit event will call a database. It will attempt to call a backend. So if I disable this prevent default, and we go here and we click enter, look up here, nothing's happening. And then, oh, did you see that? It refreshed the page. It tried to call an endpoint and it's like, no endpoint exists, guys. We're coming back. So that's really annoying. Usually you do want to submit a form to a server, but if you're building a front-end web page, you don't want to do that. So we can disable that. So that's another thing about events. And so, how did I learn this in the first round when I first started developing? I didn't know that was happening. I said, I eventually found out that it's like, hey, this is refreshing every time I click enter. So I said form refresh on enter or something in Google, and they found out, and I found out, oh, okay, so we need to stop that. So let's kind of look at what's happening once we click the button. So we grab the input element, right? So then this is something you've seen, document.getElementById, by ID, list add input. So this is the ID it's looking for. And if we kind of scan through this page here, we have this input element with list add input. So it's grabbing this input. And then it's saying this function right here that I created, create item with the value of this input element. So input elements have a value field, and this value field is what it's filled with, or what it's currently filled with. So whatever data I have, so this is its value right now. And so we call create element or create item, and create item does a whole bunch of things. Let's kind of separate them out. Oops. Okay, so let's see what we're doing first. First, we create element, right? And this is something that I showed in the slides that I wanted to get across. We can create a new element. This is a div. So this is the type. So you can put a P, H1, aside if you want to get fancy. But I'm just using a div because, rapid prototyping, just use divs and fill them out as you need. And then we're assigning a couple things to this div. So remember, this is a document object model. It is a HTML node that we can access through JavaScript. So we're sending its class name to item. And you might be saying, what's class name? Isn't it supposed to be class? Yes, but remember, this was an afterthought. If you try to do class is a reserved key in every programming language, pretty much. And that's, defining a class. So you can't do .class. So JavaScript was an afterthought. It's .class name, but it is the class property. So the class property is .class name. And that's the only one that changes. Everything else is as it was, .style, .inner HTML. Everything else is the same. Class changed because reserved keyword. So anyway, so we're giving it a class name, and we're saying its inner HTML should be the name. And what is name? it was the value of the input, right? So that's what name is. So we're saying it's inner, well, the content it contains will be the name. And then we're adding these two things. So this add event listener, we're saying listen for this event and call this function when that happens. So this click event is saying when an element gets clicked on, call this function, delete me. And we can see that does work, right? When I click on this element, it gets deleted. So, and we can see the refresh logic. I didn't reload the page. So yeah, that's, and then we have this set attribute. So it's like, what about an attribute that's not predefined? Because we can create our own attributes. And a common method is to start an attribute with data dash, because there is no default attribute that exists. So in here, I can create my own attribute, right? This is not a valid HTML attribute, but it will exist. And so if we kind of reload the page, inspect the element, we can see it right here, right? This is obviously, oops, I'm just goofed that. This is obviously not an HTML element attribute, but you can create your own attributes. So a common thing to do is prefix it with data, because like if I wanted to create my own class attribute and I called it class, well, guess what? That exists already. But if we do data dash class, there is nothing that starts with data dash. So we can guarantee that it will be a unique thing that's not a reserved key term. So we're setting a unique attribute that does not exist. And so this is the key. So we're saying if I were to manually do this as if I am JavaScript, data dash index equals, and then items dot length. And items is an array, so this would be the length of an array. So this would be like, 12 or something, whatever the length of the array is. So that we're setting this, and this comes in later when we decide which element we're deleting. And there's last one right here. So this is another DOM node, right? So this is the list container, which is this empty div right here. And then we're saying append child. So this is another function that an HTML node has. And so we can append this thing we just created with all these properties to our node or to our website. So if we kind of look at this right here, we can see this is the list container, and inside of it are these two items. If I type in a new one, it gets added to this here. And if I type in another one, it gets added here. And you can see this index counting up. And if I hit delete, it gets deleted, but these other two indices don't change. I'm pretty sure that's a bug, but anyway, see, yeah. And then this is how I added to local storage. So JSON is yet another globally defined thing that's declared to you. It is a way to encode and decode data into a string. So we can do JSON.stringify an array of number, and let's show what this looks like. So we can do it in here because it's globally defined .stringify, and we can pass in a JavaScript array. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then when we call it, it returns this string, which is the JSON. If you guys don't know what JSON is, it's a kind of file format that stores data. So it's a JSON string that represents that. And then if we copy paste this string, we can decode the data we just encoded with JSON.parse. And then we pass in the string, and then it gets parsed back into a JavaScript array for us. So we can kind of go back and forth between a string. Why do you need to do this? Because this session storage or local storage can only accept strings as this part. So in StormHacks, that didn't matter because dark and light are strings that we're storing. In this case, we're storing an array, but it doesn't know how to do that. So we need to convert it into a string that it knows how to store. So yeah, that's how we're storing the data to local storage. If we quickly look at delete me, so first we remove it from the local storage array. And that's just so that when we refresh the page, it's actually gone. And then we delete it from the page. So we have this list container element, which came from up here, and we're removing, and here we're passing in an HTML DOM node, right? So this is event.target. Remember, I said that this is an actual HTML. We can actually console log it before it gets deleted. And oops. And if we go to console and we click on this, hey, look, this is an actual HTML element represented in JavaScript. So we can see it was test, it had index 1, class of item, and it's now gone. So yeah, we're literally grabbing an HTML node and we're saying, hey, remove that. If that exists inside of you, get rid of it. That's pretty much all the JavaScript involved in making this app, right? So you're listening for different events. At the end of the day, you're listening for different events and then manipulating nodes through create element, append element or append child, remove child, get element by ID or query selector, and then changing its properties. So that's how you can dynamically make your website dynamic. And then the other half of it is really nice CSS, which mostly comes down to designers. We are lucky to have an extremely talented designer at Surge. Her name is Michelle. She's great. She gave a talk yesterday about how to design stuff. So she designed this, and then I just did the coding. And as you guys can see, I didn't actually code it right. If you go on a small screen, it doesn't look great. But yeah, that's about everything I got. We got 10 minutes left. And so if anyone's got any questions, we can kind of go through those. Okay, so yeah, that was a lot of info. And that's just because there's a lot that goes into web development. If you kind of think about it, web development is like learning a new language and three new syntaxes, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and a rendering engine, which is CSS, and an interactive engine, which is JavaScript's document API. So there's a lot. What are my tips for web development for hackathon? Don't bother with so like jQuery is something that people or sorry, not jQuery. I just saw that and I said that, complete brain fart. A lot of people say like, oh, use best practices, blah blah blah. You're in a hackathon. You're on a very tight deadline. The point of a hackathon is to get a working prototype, not a production system. So if you're not doing best practices, so my solution for the most part, and also you're not coding for long enough for you to start feeling the effects of bad code, right? So if you do bad code and your project grows big, you'll start running into some problems, right? Bugs that you can't seem to fix. You're not coding for that long. So for the most part, find the first solution and use that first solution. Don't bother thinking about, is this efficient? Is this secure? Just kind of do it. And you'll be a lot better off, right? Because a slightly buggy, really well feature established project will probably look a lot better than a best practices but very small project. So try and kind of manage your time in that way. jQuery and Bootstrap. So if you want to learn something that's not much more than this, right? Especially if you're new to this kind of land, this web development land, jQuery is a really powerful tool. Everyone hates jQuery nowadays because it's so old. But if you're doing something low level like this, something that, and yes, I did just call front end development low level. This is relatively low level to what we use now, but it's kind of the roots. So jQuery really simplifies this stuff. So like instead of doing document.createElement, document.get element by ID. jQuery gives you this $ function that you can use. I'm not going to go through jQuery right now, but if look into jQuery. If your plan going in was to do this, look into jQuery. It will probably speed up your life. Bootstrap is a way to make CSS a much less painful experience. So here it will give you a bunch of predefined classes. So like here I have a class where I just do outline 9 or something like that, right? So some really small pieces of code. And so instead of wasting my time writing that, they will give you a bunch of predefined classes that you can just attach. And to make your CSS work a lot quicker, you find the right set of classes to do what you want, and they'll do it. And so you can make your CSS file much smaller. Yeah, the next step up, if you felt like this was kind of easy, is React. React is a fully fledged front-end framework. It completely gets rid of HTML. It's now included into JavaScript. Your CSS is also kind of different than the way you name classes and stuff. But it's another learning curve. So if this was already a learning curve, then maybe stick with this for a hackathon. But if you already know this stuff, learn React. I'm doing a workshop on React on February 9th, by the way. Self plugin. Let's go find it. STORMHACKS. Here we go. React right here at 5:30 on February 9th. Tips on how to incorporate APIs into a project. Yes, APIs. There are a couple of very nice APIs for you to use. Google Maps API is extremely pleasant to work with in vanilla.js, which is what you just learned. How to incorporate it into it is, honestly, it might not be a bad idea to do a quick tutorial at the beginning of a hackathon or something like that. Be like, oh, so on the hackathon, it's like, oh, we want to make a map-based thing. While your designer is designing, or while your team is thinking of ideas, get one person to go and actually do a tutorial on how to use Google Maps API in JavaScript, something like that, so that because there's a lot of documentation, a lot of things to read. Personally, I prefer to watch a video. So if you prefer to do that, you can do that. Yeah. Aside from that, stay away, especially if this is your first web development project, stay away from APIs that are not well established. So it's like, you find some like weather app from your local city that has an API. Maybe don't use that. It's probably going to be a pain in the ass to use. There's probably going to be issues with it, bugs, or some limitations. Stick with the big names: Spotify API, Google Maps API. Google has a lot of other APIs that you can use. If you're using a weather API, find something from like a national level or something that you can use, like a Canadian weather API. I'm not sure if one exists, but look for something big name. Yeah. I think I will pass it back to Ravika for a wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you, Ali. This was an amazing presentation. If you guys have any other last minute questions, y'all can pop it in the chat or maybe turn on your mics and ask.
Oh yeah, also a couple notes. All of this code that we just beautifully wrote very quickly, I will put that on GitHub, and I'm sure we will get that link to you. This meeting was recorded, so there's a recording of this, and also the presentation. I will talk to Punir and get the presentation out there too.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Keep an eye on our workshops. Just like Ali mentioned, we have another workshop on React and hooks on the 9th. Then we have a workshop on Android Studio on the 13th. And we have our pre-launch party on the 19th from 6 to 7:30. Thank you. Do you guys have any other questions? See you guys at StormHacks.
awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for joining in today.